Verric Uros was quickly becoming renowned as one of the most gracious hosts in the kingdom. The 7 feasts that separated each event of the tournament were open to the small folk and nobility alike. Each knight was welcome among the high tables, and every scrap of leftover food was taken to the Sept and served to the poor. The knights ate and drank their fill, each preparing themselves for the joust to come. Edrik, Delmar, and Dickon Langhorne sat in the stuffy healer's tent, the air thick with incense and hot from the fires in the braziers. Sweat was pouring down Edric's bare chest as the healer examined the bruise upon it. The day of the melee, it had consumed his entire shoulder, upper arm, and right side of his chest. Now it was no more than a dark spot of skin the size of a fist on Edric's collar. The healer gave him his blessing and nodded for Dickon to approach. Dickon moved towards the man, and Edrik rolled off the small table on which he was being examined. Pulling his tunic over his head, he was met with the most unwelcome sight he could have imagined in that moment. Lionel Redfield had entered the tent, dressed in a suit of armor, his long hair pulled back tightly and clasped behind his head with a black ring adorned with golden leaf. Edrik clenched his fist and growled at the knight. "Come here to have the healer treat your moonblood," he quipped, his face entirely unable to contain his contempt. Dickon, caught off guard by Edric's question, turned to the melee winner and scowled. "I thought your entourage was a standard part of your armory. I meant to ask which fine artisan you used, so I could get one for myself." Lionel's lips pursed, and Dickon thought he could see something of a flush in his cheeks. He flashed a slight frown and obvious discomfort. "The boy at your tent said I could find the both of you here." He did not appear threatening, but Dickon knew better than to trust an enemy's intentions. "I came to apologize." The statement took Dickon by surprise. Edrik roared enraged and slammed his fists on the table. "Gods take your apologies." Spittle was forming in the corners of his mouth. "You are no man of honor." Lionel made no attempt to stop Edric's verbal tirade. He simply frowned deeper and continued. "The fight was not fair, and I wanted to wish you both luck in the joust to come. I hope we can meet in the lists and prove ourselves honorable." He moved aside Edric's horn tankard, which was full of fresh water, and sat down on the edge of the table. "I believe you two are the finest knights in this tournament, and Uros would be a fool to leave you out of his band of adventurers." Dickon held his hand up to halt Edric's advance on Lionel, yet he did not break eye contact with the fair-haired knight. "Flattery won't save you in the lists," he warned, indicating Lionel to leave. The knight stood and nodded to the pair. "7 blessings." And he was gone. Dickon exhaled and sat back on the examination table as the healer looked at his knee. It had twisted wrong in the melee, and he was still being ginger with it. The pain was no more than a dull throbbing, but he wanted to be sure it would not hinder him in the competition to come. Edrik reached angrily for his water and emptied it into his mouth, twin floods pouring from the corners of his lips. Together, the pair walked back to their pavilions to suit up in their armor and prepare for the jousting. Titus was waiting outside the tent. As he saw them approaching, he stood and ran to them, apologizing for revealing their location to Lionel. Dickon silenced him with a finger and a glare, and set about putting on his armor.
"7 blessings, noble knights!"
The steward of the games boomed into his cone horn. Verric Uros was watching intently, scanning the group of 60 knights set to compete in the joust. His eyes met Dickon's, and for a moment, Dickon was certain he smiled.
"You fine warriors have proven yourselves worthy of this challenge, facing one another in the ancient sport of jousting. Each of you will be paired randomly with another knight, and half the field will be eliminated in each round. Once a knight is unseated from their horse, the 2 competitors are to skirmish in hand-to-hand combat to determine a winner."
Dickon looked at Edrik next to him. The white-haired giant seemed pale, and sweat was beading on his brow. "You okay?" he asked, nudging Edrik with the pommel of his sword. This time, Edrik did not return his nudge. "I'm not feeling myself," he said, never taking his eyes off the high stand and the nobility seated upon it. "Must have ate something queer."
"May the warrior grant you strength,"
the steward continued in his booming voice.
"Now let the jousting begin."
The first round of knights took their places on either end of the list. Edrik and Dickon had drawn their names and taken their places, both assigned to the same side of the long dividing fence of the arena. Dickon opened his scroll, revealing the name of his opponent, Sir Tymond, the knight to whom he was a squire. Edrik was steel-faced, seated and watching intently as the first two jousters crashed into one another, splitting lances and remaining in their saddles. As they both turned, two young boys placed a new lance in each knight's hand, and they charged once more. "Edrik, I drew Sir Tymond," Dickon announced, folding his paper back up and looking to his friend. Edrik grunted, still watching the joust. "You gonna throw the joust?" "It would be the honorable thing to do, but I won't get my knighthood if I don't win." "Tough choice," Edrik grunted again, beads of sweat beginning to pool up on his forehead. "God, it's worse than the healer's tent out here." Dickon ignored his last comment. "I came all this way to earn the knighthood Sir Tymond never gave me. Maybe if I beat him, he will know he made a mistake." "Or he'll box your ears," suggested Edrik. "All the same, if I don't try, I won't know." Edric's first joust was against a stout knight with a checkered green and white doublet and a helm resembling a boar's head. Two tusks jutted out from each side of the knight's visor, and his lance was patterned in the same manner as his doublet. Edrik used one lance, placed deftly on the man's chest to unseat him, and sent him spiraling to the dust. Landing on his head, the knight could not continue to fight hand to hand. Dickon used only two lances to unseat Sir Tymond. He thought he would feel a measure of relief when it ended, but he only felt sadness. He wanted to yell insults at the selfish old man, scream profanity for withholding the knighthood he had worked so hard to earn, but as he saw the aged Sir Tymond sputtering curses in the dirt and watched him spit at the foot of Dickon's horse, he only felt sorrow. There was no combat following that joust as Sir Tymond stormed from the list, naming honor as his reason for yielding. With each passing round, Dickon and Edrik found themselves at the same end of the lists, and each round left Edrik looking more and more pale. At last, only 4 jousters remained: Edrik, Dickon, Sir Gendry the Griffin, and Lionel Redfield. Dickon and Edrik were once again side by side in the lists, and Edrik was preparing to mount his black stallion. The beast was 18 hands tall, bearing the name Dragon. He might as well have been his namesake. The mighty steed stamped the dirt impatiently as Edrik situated himself on the saddle, winded already, and appearing more frail than Dickon had ever seen him. Looking across the list, Dickon could see Lionel mounting his fine stallion. This was the match the crowd had been hoping for, yet Dickon was uneasy with Edric's current condition. The steward of the games announced the name of the 2 knights, and the crowd roared with delight as they moved into position on the horses. The blast from the horn was deafening, and Edrik raced down the list as quickly as lightning striking. Dickon looked at Lionel and saw him moving with grace and speed. Something was strangely familiar about the way in which Lionel was riding, though. With a mixture of shock and awe, Dickon realized what he was seeing. Lionel was mimicking Dickon's riding style perfectly. It was too late to shout. Edrik had already slowed his pace and was hesitating with his lance. Lionel's lance crashed directly into Edric's shoulder, exploding into a shower of splinters and completely unseating Edrik. One pass was all it took, and Edrik had been knocked down. Watching in horror, Dickon saw Edrik lying flat on his back in the dust as Lionel swung down from his saddle and went to draw his sword. The steward gave another blast of the horn, and Lionel halted in his tracks. Dickon ran out onto the field, ignoring the throbbing pain in his knee, and slid on his knees beside his friend. Edrik was mumbling, a slurry of words hard to make out at first, but as Dickon leaned closer, he heard, I can't hurt Dickon. He's been poisoned, a voice said behind Dickon. Turning quickly, Dickon was met with the gaze of Verric Uros. Gleaming in his dark gray doublet with ornate embroidery and bold leather tunic, Verric turned his eyes to Edrik. He must be treated immediately, or else he will die. Dickon wanted to shout to Verric that it was Lionel that poisoned Edrik. He was certain it was him, to disqualify him and end his acts of dishonor, but no sound would come out of his mouth. He swallowed hard and stood. Edrik was carried off, and Verric returned to the high stands. Dickon unseated Gendry the Griffin in the next joust, breaking 6 lances before finally knocking him down. The pair struggled in combat, but Dickon deftly parried a high strike from the knight and caved in his helmet, forcing him to yield. As Dickon returned to his horse, he knew what was next for him. All the weight of his goals and aspiration hinged on the next joust. If he could succeed, every dream he had ever had would come true in an instant. Lionel had already won the melee, and he only had glory to gain from winning the joust. Perhaps, if Dickon wanted it more than him, he could upset the obvious favorite and take what he desired most in the world. Looking across the list at the gleaming silver and crimson armor of Lionel Redfield, Dickon heard neither the steward, nor the games, nor the shouts of encouragement from Titus. All he heard was the blast of the horn and the roar from his throat. He dug his heels into the black mane beneath him and shouted, "For Edrik!"